Good evening, dear listeners, and welcome to another spine-tingling episode of our scary stories. I am your host, who walks through the veil between worlds, your guiding voice in this realm of darkness and dread. Turn off the lights, light a candle if you dare, and prepare yourself for tonight's tale, a journey into the deepest recesses of human longing, where the very things we desire become our ultimate undoing. Ellen sat at her cluttered desk, the dim glow from her laptop screen casting an unflattering pallor on her face. The constant ping of emails arriving in her inbox seemed like the electronic whip cracks of an unrelenting taskmaster. Her eyes flicked nervously to the clock, almost midnight, and still so much work to do. Outside, the city was shrouded in a smoggy mist, which seeped into her cramped apartment despite her best efforts. A lonely car horn echoed far below, a forlorn sound swallowed by the never-ending sea of concrete and asphalt. It was a muffled symphony of urban life, and it played mercilessly on Ellen's nerves, mirroring the storm inside her head. Her fingers danced across the keyboard in frenzied rhythms, typing, deleting, and retyping. There were spreadsheets to finish, reports to file, and endless strings of virtual meetings that had left her exhausted. She glanced at the framed picture beside her laptop, showing her with Michael, both smiling like two people who had not yet discovered the ravages of grown-up life. He had been working late nights too, consumed by his own worries. Conversations had become transactional, almost as if they were colleagues exchanging pleasantries. The spark was fading, and it scared her. Just then, her phone vibrated, a new message. But it wasn't another email or text from Michael asking when she'd be going to bed. It was a notification from the lobby, package for Ellen. Intrigued, she braved the chill of the night air, padding through the threadbare carpet of the hallway in her slippers, and descended in the elevator that groaned with each passing floor as if in protest. At the reception, a single box waited for her, elegant but unassuming, no return address. She thanked the sleepy concierge and carried the package back up to her apartment. With a sense of ceremony, she sliced open the tape and peered inside. A snow globe rested there, nestled within layers of bubble wrap like a precious gem. She lifted it out and set it carefully on her dining table. It was intricately crafted with an astonishing level of detail, a miniature winter village enclosed in glass. The houses were speckled with faux snow, and the trees seemed almost real, their tiny leaves frosted with a layer of white. It was the epitome of a winter wonderland. Captivated, Ellen shook the globe gently. The faux snow swirled around in a tranquil dance, settling softly on rooftops and pavements. But what caught her eye was a woman standing in the middle of the village square. She wore a red scarf and a beanie, her hands tucked into her coat pockets, a look of profound contentment on her face. It was as if the woman had captured the essence of serenity, frozen in time. Something about the miniature woman's features struck Ellen as eerily familiar. She leaned in closer, her eyes widening as the realization dawned on her. The woman in the snow globe looked almost identical to her, right down to the mole on her cheek. Yet, there was one glaring difference. This miniature version of Ellen seemed ecstatically happy, unburdened by the weight of adult responsibilities, deadlines, and strained relationships. For the first time in weeks, Ellen's lips curled into a smile, her eyes softening as she lost herself in this perfect little world. The snow globe was not just an object, it was an invitation to a life she had never lived, a promise of the happiness she had long forgotten. For a brief moment, she forgot about the pinging laptop, the unanswered emails, and the man she barely spoke to anymore. The snow globe had become her escape, her sanctuary, even if it was no larger than the span of her palm. Just then, her phone buzzed on the table, snapping her back to reality. Another email, another reminder of her life, waiting to pull her back into its frantic orbit. With a sigh, she placed the snow globe back on the table. But as she walked back to her desk, Ellen couldn't shake off the image of her doppelganger in the globe. It was as if she had left a piece of herself there, in that idyllic village square. As she sat down to resume her work, Ellen's eyes were drawn once more to the snow globe. The miniature Ellen still stood there, in the middle of the winter village, almost as if beckoning her to step inside and leave it all behind. And for a fleeting moment, Ellen wished she could. Little did she know, wishes have a way of coming true, especially those whispered in moments of profound longing, standing on the precipice between despair and hope. The clock on her wall chimed midnight, but inside the snow globe, time seemed to stand still. The miniature Ellen looked happier than ever, and as the real Ellen returned to her laptop, A chill ran down her spine, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Ellen's mornings had acquired a new ritual, and it wasn't coffee or a brisk jog. Each day, before even brushing her teeth, she would make her way to the dining table where the snow globe rested. With a mixture of reverence and anticipation, she'd give it a gentle shake, setting the tiny snowflakes swirling around the idyllic village. She'd watch, entranced, as the miniature version of herself looked up, arms outstretched to the sky, embracing the falling snow as if it were the essence of life itself. The woman's happiness was almost radiant, glowing through the glass orb like a beacon in a world shrouded in fog. Days turned into weeks, and each morning, Ellen noticed subtle changes in her glass-enclosed counterpart. The woman's posture was more relaxed, her smile wider. There was an undeniable air of contentment about her that Ellen found both comforting and unsettling. It was as if each shake of the snow globe added another layer to the woman's happiness, while also heightening the contrast between their two lives. While the woman in the globe seemed to thrive, Ellen's life was fraying at the edges. Her performance at work started to suffer. Emails went unanswered, deadlines were missed, and even her once immaculate wardrobe began to show signs of neglect. Michael had noticed too, but he didn't know how to reach her anymore. "You've been distant lately," he'd say, looking at her with eyes clouded by concern and confusion. "Is everything okay?" "Yeah," Ellen would reply absent-mindedly, her thoughts miles away. Her eyes would invariably wander back to the snow globe, where her miniature self seemed to be living a life of eternal happiness, insulated from the world's troubles. Her friends had begun to comment as well. Sarah, her closest confidant, had seen enough. "Ellen, you're not yourself. You're obsessed with that thing," she'd point out, gesturing toward the snow globe during one of her visits. "It's just a hobby," Ellen would counter, defensive and a bit evasive, a harmless way to unwind. But Sarah was not convinced. "Hobbies don't make people withdraw from life, Elle. You're slipping away, and it's frightening." Even her mother, who lived states away, sensed that something was amiss during their phone calls. "You seem distracted, darling. Is everything all right?" she'd ask, her voice tinged with a motherly worry that distance could not dilute. It was true. Ellen's reality had started to become porous, the borders between her world and the one inside the snow globe blurring with each passing day. She found herself losing time, her gaze fixated on the wintry scene, thoughts wandering through the streets of the miniature village as though she were a resident and not just a spectator. One particular evening, as twilight merged into the indigo hues of night, Ellen sat alone in her dimly lit apartment. The streetlights outside cast wavering shadows on her walls, like wraiths pacing back and forth, waiting for an invitation to enter. Her phone lay beside her, a catalog of missed calls and unread messages that she could no longer muster the will to check. Her eyes fell upon the snow globe. A woman inside was radiant, practically exuding joy from every pore. Ellen shook the globe once more, watching the woman twirl in the falling snow, a picture of utter jubilance. It was a stark contrast to her own reflection in the window, a disheveled woman, lost in a labyrinth of questions with no answers. Something was happening, something inexplicable yet profoundly unsettling. As the snow settled in the globe, Ellen felt a pull, a yearning to trade places with the woman whose life seemed perfect. The sensation enveloped her, warm yet chilling, like stepping into a hot bath on a winter's day, only to find the water turning to ice around you. And then, as if her thoughts had triggered an unseen mechanism, the woman inside the snow globe looked straight at her, smiling with an invitation that was impossible to ignore. For Ellen, the world outside the globe ceased to exist, and in that moment, reality bent, wavered, and seemed ready to break. Her phone buzzed again, but Ellen was far, far away, teetering on the edge of a decision that could either shatter her world or complete it. She felt herself sinking deeper into a trance, her finger hovering above the glass surface of the globe, as if about to touch another dimension. It was no longer just a piece of decor on her dining table. It had become a portal, a vortex pulling her in, promising something she had longed for yet feared in equal measure, a happiness so intense it could obliterate all that she knew, all that she was. As her finger made contact with the cold glass, Ellen felt a jolt run through her, an electric charge so powerful it seemed to originate from the depths of her soul. She pulled her hand back quickly, almost as if scorched. Her heart pounded against her ribcage, and she felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. But as she looked at the globe one more time, the woman inside seemed to wink at her, as if sharing a secret that only the two of them understood. And for the first time, Ellen felt a sense of foreboding, an inkling that she was standing on the precipice of an abyss, the depths of which she could neither see nor comprehend. Yet there was no turning back. She had already taken the first step, and the journey, whether she liked it or not, had irrevocably begun. Ellen's life was unraveling like a poorly knit sweater, each thread of stability and happiness coming loose with alarming speed. Work had become a quagmire of unmet deadlines and disappointed faces. Mr. Thompson, her boss, called her into his office, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and unspoken reprimands. "Ellen, this isn't like you. Your performance has been less than satisfactory, and we can't overlook it any longer," he said, his gaze locking onto hers as if trying to search for the employee he once knew. The dim light from his table lamp flickered across his features, casting shadows that made him look both stern and somewhat disheartened. "I understand, Mr. Thompson," Ellen managed to reply, her voice betraying a fatigue that weighed on her like lead. At home, the situation wasn't much better. Michael had become a fixture on the periphery of her life, circling her like a satellite disconnected from its orbiting planet. Their conversations were sparse, filled with an unspeakable tension that they both avoided acknowledging. "Are you okay?" Michael would occasionally venture, his voice tinged with a despair he couldn't fully mask. "I'm just tired," Ellen would always reply, a veil of weariness muting the emotional palette of her life to dull grays. The stillness of her apartment was now a cavern of isolation. It absorbed the muted sounds of the outside world, honking cars, chatter from passerby, the distant laughter of families coming home, and left an echo of solitude. Her plants, once vibrant and full of life, had begun to wilt, their drooping leaves mirroring her own decline. And then there was the snow globe, the only source of light in a growing sea of darkness. Its allure had become almost hypnotic. Ellen would sit for hours, shaking it, watching the snow descend like soft whispers on the idyllic world inside. And always, her doppelganger in that tiny village seemed happier, her life a crescendo of joy and contentment. In a moment of utter vulnerability, Ellen broke. "I wish I could be you. I wish I could trade places with you," she said softly, her voice little more than a husk as she gazed into the globe. The words felt like a betrayal, yet the relief they brought was instant, like lancing a wound that had festered for far too long. As her words hung in the air, a silence engulfed the room. The ambient sounds from outside seemed to fade away, as if someone had turned the volume knob of the world counterclockwise. Time itself appeared to pause, the seconds stretching out into an eternity that was both brief and interminable. The atmosphere grew dense, suffused with an electrifying sense of impending change. The light in the room dimmed for a heartbeat, long enough to send an icy shiver down Ellen's spine. She felt a vibration, a minute tremor that emanated from the snow globe and spread like ripples on a pond, making her skin tingle with static. And then, just as abruptly, the room snapped back to reality. Sounds from the world beyond her window flowed back into her apartment, filling the void of silence. But something was fundamentally altered. The air seemed to have thickened, as though charged with the residue of her uttered wish. Ellen's gaze was riveted to the snow globe. Her miniature self was smiling, but this time, the smile seemed to hold a new quality, something Ellen had never seen before: recognition. It was as if the woman inside knew her secret longing, and more terrifyingly, was capable of making it come true. The walls of the apartment seemed to close in on her, as if echoing the constriction she felt within her chest. A palpable dread settled in the pit of her stomach, twisting into a knot of foreboding. The line between her world and the one inside the snow globe had not just blurred, it had been crossed. And Ellen couldn't shake the chilling feeling that her life was about to irrevocably diverge onto a path from which there was no return. Ellen awoke to a burst of sunlight filtering through her curtains, so brilliant and golden that it felt almost unnatural. Blinking away the remnants of sleep, she sat up in bed, stretching her arms and taking in the comforting sense of freshly baked bread and blooming flowers. It was as if the entire atmosphere had been perfumed. Confused but intrigued, she stepped out of bed, her feet landing on a plush carpet that felt like cool grass under her toes. She felt unusually refreshed, the burdens of her old life fading away like a distant nightmare. Everything seemed touched by an ethereal beauty, each object and piece of furniture exquisite and picture-perfect. Dressed in a beautiful white gown, she walked toward her window and opened it. Her eyes widened. Gone were the bustling city streets, replaced by a landscape of eternal winter, majestic and pristine. Children were building snowmen, while couples skated on a frozen pond. A whole village was buzzing with a sense of perpetual happiness, its residents a picture of contentment and ease. A wave of euphoria washed over Ellen as she stepped outside, greeted warmly by neighbors whose names she somehow knew despite never having met them. "Good morning, Ellen," they chorused as she walked past gardens filled with winter roses and homes adorned with twinkling fairy lights. "No work today, Ellen. Enjoy the fair," exclaimed Mrs. Johnson, a friendly older woman who lived a few doors down. Her voice was warm, filled with an affection that felt almost motherly. As Ellen strolled through the picturesque village, she encountered more residents who greeted her with smiles and waves, their eyes gleaming with an unspoken recognition. The stresses of work, the strain of her relationship, and the burdens of adult life seemed to belong to another universe altogether. And yet, as she settled into this newly discovered paradise, Ellen began to notice peculiarities, tiny cracks in the facade. Birds sat in the trees, but their beaks remained closed, never offering the expected melodies. She picked up a book from a beautifully crafted wooden bench, only to find its pages blank, devoid of text or images. More unsettling was the sky, an endless tapestry of blue that never changed, as if frozen in a single moment. No clouds ever marred its perfection, no winds ever disturbed its stillness. Even the faces of the people, though friendly and welcoming, held a uniformity in their expressions that unnerved her. Their smiles seemed perpetual, unchanging, almost as if painted on. Perhaps most disconcerting was the evening fair she attended. Games were set up, stalls were teeming with winter treats, and villagers moved about enjoying the festivities. But something was missing. The laughter, though loud, felt hollow, as if echoing in a void. And the music, what should have been the heart and soul of any fair, was oddly mechanical, a repeated set of notes that looped over and over again, like a record stuck in an endless groove. A creeping sense of unease took root in Ellen's heart. The very elements of this world that had first enamored her now felt eerie in their perfection. Each smile from a neighbor, each perfectly sculpted snowflake, each immaculate petal on the winter roses began to feel like pieces of a much darker puzzle. She started to suspect that the village, in all its storybook splendor, was not just an escape but a trap, a gilded cage that might have closed its door behind her forever. As she stood there, in the midst of a world that seemed lifted straight from a dream yet felt increasingly nightmarish, Ellen couldn't escape the harrowing thought that she had been beguiled into leaving her flawed, challenging, but real world for this, a beautiful illusion that might just conceal an unimaginable horror. As days turned into weeks, Ellen's fascination with the pristine world around her shifted into a troubling discomfort. There was a repetitive rhythm to life in the globe, as though each day was but a gentle variation on the one before. The once enchanting loop of harmonious faces and unending festivities had begun to feel like a looping record, scratching at the edges of her sanity. "Isn't this beautiful, Ellen?" said Mr. Thompson, the local baker, handing her a freshly baked cinnamon roll. His fingers were spotless, nails impeccably manicured. He wore a perpetual smile that now seemed more like a mask than an expression of genuine joy. "It's lovely," she replied, forcing a smile, "but don't you ever want something more? Something different?" The moment the words left her mouth, Mr. Thompson's face seemed to stiffen, though his smile never wavered. "Different is just a way to spoil perfection, don't you think?" he said, his voice maintaining its cordial tone but eyes betraying a glint of something else, caution, perhaps, or suspicion. Determined to get some answers, Ellen approached Mrs. Johnson, who was tending to her winter roses. "Mrs. Johnson, this place is heavenly, but it's also strange. Where are we exactly? Is this all there is?" Mrs. Johnson paused and looked up, her eyes meeting Ellen's. For the first time, Ellen noticed how they seemed devoid of depth, like polished stones. "Why, we're home, Ellen, and home is where the heart is. There's nothing more one could ask for." The cryptic nature of her response left Ellen with an unsettling feeling that nestled like a stone in her gut. The vagueness of it all, the way the villagers deflected her questions with empty smiles and platitudes, it was like hitting a wall of fog. Driven by a new sense of urgency, Ellen decided she had to leave, to escape this idyllic prison. She made her way to what she thought was the edge of the village, where the white expanse of snow met a forest of towering, perfectly symmetrical trees. Each step was heavier than the last, as if the very ground beneath her was trying to hold her back. When she finally reached the boundary, she took a deep breath, bracing herself for the unknown, and stepped into the forest. But the moment she did, a disorienting sense of vertigo overwhelmed her. Her vision blurred, and her surroundings seemed to twist and warp in a dizzying kaleidoscope of colors. When her sight finally cleared, she found herself back in the village square, standing near the frozen pond where couples were still skating in blissful ignorance. Dumbfounded and disoriented, Ellen felt her pulse quicken. What sort of world had she trapped herself in? As she looked around at the smiling faces, the eternal winter, and the too perfect symmetry of it all, a cold realization settled over her. This wasn't just an escape from her old life. It was a trap, a place from which there might be no leaving. It was a world that answered none of her questions, a maze without exits, and Ellen was caught in its intricate web, struggling to find a way out. The monotony of Ellen's days was broken by an unexpected ripple in the globe's static universe. As she stood in the village square, a new figure caught her eye. A man, disheveled and visibly stressed, had appeared beside the ornate clock tower. His eyes darted around nervously, absorbing the surreal yet idyllic setting with a mix of awe and disbelief. He was a splash of chaos in this overly ordered world, and Ellen felt an unexplainable pull towards him. It was only as she took a step to approach the newcomer that she realized something chilling. Her body moved with a grace and smile that felt disconcertingly automatic, as if she was a marionette being guided by unseen strings. Her arms opened wide, inviting, her face radiant with a happiness that wasn't hers. "Welcome," she heard herself say as she neared him, her voice soaked in a warmth she didn't feel. "You're going to love it here." The man looked at her, and for a moment, their eyes locked. Ellen tried to convey a warning, a desperate plea for him to run. But her eyes betrayed none of her urgency. They sparkled invitingly instead. "Who are you?" he asked, a cautious curiosity lining his voice. "I'm Ellen," she responded, her voice brimming with an enthusiasm that sounded foreign to her own ears. "And this is home." As the word home escaped her lips, a cold, sinking feeling settled deep within Ellen. She knew now that she had become an integral cog in the wheel of this ceaseless machine, a siren luring souls into an eternal still life. She was compelled to beckon him closer, to be the joyous face that would greet newcomers, the ambassador of a happiness she could neither feel nor escape. The man took a tentative step closer, lured by her irresistible charm, and the enchanting world that lay spread out before him. Ellen's heart broke for him, even as her lips curved in a jubilant smile, her arms extending in a welcoming embrace. She wished she could scream, wished she could warn him to flee this gilded cage. But wishes, she realized, were the most dangerous things in this world of perpetual happiness, for they could chain you in invisible fetters, forcing you to become a part of the very nightmare you wished to escape. And as the man's hesitant steps turned into a confident stride, crossing the boundary that separated him from this world, and her, Ellen knew she had become both a prisoner and a jailer in a realm that thrived on the unspoken horrors of unfulfilled desires. In a modest apartment adorned with minimalist decor, Karen, Ellen's younger sister, rifled through drawers and files, trying to make sense of the enigmatic void her sister's disappearance had left. The atmosphere was heavy with an amalgamation of stale coffee, unanswered questions, and unspoken fears. Ellen's presence seemed to permeate every nook, from the dog-eared self-help books on the shelves to the faded photographs that adorned the walls. Karen came across a snow globe resting on a side table in the living room, surrounded by a pile of unpaid bills and unread magazines. It was a beautiful piece, displaying a winter village that seemed lifted from the pages of a storybook. A woman stood in the square, her face an epitome of serenity and bliss, uncannily similar to Ellen. The resemblance was startling, but rather than alarming Karen, it filled her with a sort of quiet, melancholy comfort. She shook the snow globe gently, watching as a flurry of snowflakes danced around the woman. The small figure seemed to come alive for a moment, her face glowing with a deep-seated happiness. "Maybe she's found her peace at last," Karen murmured to herself, contemplating the tranquil face inside the globe, which seemed a stark contrast to Ellen's frenzied, troubled demeanor in the weeks leading to her disappearance. Placing the snow globe carefully on the fireplace mantel, next to other cherished family keepsakes, Karen sighed. "If you're happy now, wherever you are, that's all that matters," she said softly, as though hoping Ellen might hear her from beyond the glass walls of her newfound world. She stepped back to appraise the setup, her eyes misting over. It looked perfect there, and she decided it would stay. Little did she know that by doing so, she had sealed the fate of the next unsuspecting soul who would fall prey to the snow globe's alluring snare. Karen turned off the lights and locked the door behind her. Life moved on, leaving behind only memories and the haunting tranquility of a snow globe, which continued to sit innocently on the mantel, biding its time. Ellen's face within the snow globe seemed to emit a muted glow in the darkened room, a facsimile of happiness that went unquestioned in a world where appearances often mask the most intricate of tragedies. Inside the glass enclosure of the snow globe, Ellen stood in the center of the winter wonderland, her eyes devoid of the panic and desperation that had initially clouded them. The small village around her was vibrant in a way that almost mocked reality, with its cottages like candid confections and skies permanently set in a dusky hue that promised but never delivered a new day. She watched as the new individual, a man burdened with the wearied lines of discontent and worry, studied the globe from the outside. As if on cue, a force Ellen could not resist surged through her, compelling her to raise her hand and beckon to him with a mysterious allure. "Come, find your peace," her expression seemed to convey, a sinister charisma radiating from her now eternal smile. He stared at her intently, as if transfixed by her newfound aura of serenity. Then he spoke the words, a wish, an incantation that Ellen knew too well. The air turned frigid for a second, colder than usual, and then he was there, inside the globe, standing right next to her. She sensed his momentary wonder, which would soon turn into the same uneasy suspicion she herself had felt. "Welcome," Ellen greeted him, her voice not her own, scripted by the malevolence that powered the globe. "You're going to love it here." From a nearby shelf in a dimly lit curio shop that smelled of old wood and unfulfilled desires, the snow globe glimmered under a soft light. Its position was no accident. It was displayed prominently, designed to catch the eye of any who walked by. The shop owner, a man of indeterminable age and features that seemed to blur the more one tried to focus on them, looked at the globe and then at a small, framed picture on the counter. The picture showed a man and a woman smiling, both figures frozen in an eternal moment of feigned happiness. "Satisfied customers," he whispered to himself, an unsettling grin crawling across his face. He turned the sign hanging on the shop door to read open, knowing it wouldn't be long before another weary soul, broken by the relentless grind of life, would walk in seeking an escape. And there, at the forefront of a myriad of cursed objects, the snow globe awaited its next victim, forever promising a happiness that was as illusory as the ceaseless snowflakes that fell within its glass walls. And so, dear listeners, we find ourselves at the edge of another abyss, reminded that sometimes the greatest horrors are not those that lurk in the shadows, but those that reside within our very souls. Thank you for joining me in this twisted tale on our scary stories. Don't forget to look over your shoulder every once in a while. You never know what might be beckoning you towards your own snow globe of despair. This is our Scary Stories signing off for tonight.